I was terrible with women. I was a virgin. But if I would die one, which was a likelihood, I was going to die in a blaze of glorious fire. Desire to know women became desire to kill men. Not odd if, all things considered, you give the metamorphosis its proper amount of scrutiny. Unfortunately, the Palati conflicts were over, and the Conqueror's quest to unite our lands had successed into parleys projected to linger well into adulthood. But, as my studies were ending, by the grace of Terciona herself, flare-ups erupted with Azad. The desert people had marched over the Red Isthmus, and the Conqueror needed men. I quickly found a replacement for all those lustful, futile daydreams. I even found Purpose herself. I didn't know why we had originally started fighting them, but I soon knew recruiters who'd soldiered under the Conqueror during our provincial warring, in the mangroves of Palat, and in the sweltering heat of Azad during the first clash. These hard faces didn't scoff at my ambition the way my father had. I will never forget the look in his eyes. Pure disbelief, holding my sister like the filling war wagons would sing her too to certain death. My grandmother, riddled with age, with help and demonstration, waved along at my departure. Finally, there was Mother herself, who through a life of domesticated piety was left incapable of understanding why some men wished to spill others' blood. As our convoy to boot camp summited the first of many hills, she prayed, lamenting the death of my innocence. It had been dead a long time. I wasn't the only lad who jumped at the recruiter's trumpet. What is so damn laughable, though, is the finer details, the details I'm sure those other lads, omit from their barroom tellings. A boy from school who had the reputation of a fearsome brawler failed the entry-level crucibles. Another, an athlete cheered on by friends and family alike for being the future nemesis of Al-Azad, that coward scurried off to the first non-combat role available. Yet I, Arcus Zevon, rose like an iron sun. Much of boot camp was like a stick in the stream that collects all the muck and the garbage. I could hardly believe my senses. Able young men wailing their lament for faraway beds, intimidated by corporal punishment, or a missing girl. It was in this period I began to see a strength that had silently developed from my perceived inferiorities. I missed no one, no woman, no endearing touch, nothing. Pain was easy. No sleep, a dream. Being told I was nothing and that I was worthless, an average day in the looking glass. I was filled with pure glee watching the same types of young men who'd once paraded and peacocked fail so miserably at military life, while I so maniacally succeeded. At the end of basic training, I was the target of much grovel and envy when I was awarded a say in which banner I was to bleed and die under. I'd always been curious how units got their identifiers. This was true for their names and especially their symbols. All sorts of fierce creatures decorated the Conqueror's shields and guidons, wolves, bears, and the like. Dragons, rumored still to exist in the other lands, were a personal favorite. I'd seen a goblin once in a performer's square when I was just a boy. The rugged hillman who'd captured the little abomination would use prodding sticks whenever the crowd coughed up a coin to make fangs clamp or claws rattle the bars of its cage. It was a hideous, smelly creature, leaving me terrified of the mountains for years. It made sense then, I suppose, for one of our larger infantry units to display such a face on their standard. Like every recruit, I'd heard the clamor while tending my wounds in the barracks. An elite group had ceased the sharpening of their arrowheads to announce a tryout. I was told their name had come from the maritime raiders who'd once fought on the beaches of Suella. The White Sand, their snapping standard brandishing an hourglass with its bone-colored sand waiting ominously all on the bottom. Time's up! This unit, caked in blood and metals and the dirt of foreign wastes, had evolved from beach stormers to covert spies and the deadliest of archers. Although trained extensively in the sword, and more arrogant than kings, their greatest source of pride was in their ability to remain unseen. Such was necessary for their greatest derivation of pleasure. A sudden arrow in an unsuspecting enemy heart was rumored to be the highest achievement attainable in these godlike ranks. And to these ranks I auditioned. It was sheer hate that got me through it all. From the first day in the beaten courtyard within the martial fortress to the indoctrination runs that began while the world slept and ended when the merchant sat for his lunch, hate got me through. And eventually, after I'd sweat and puked until my soul itself felt it had been beaten, I was a member, given sword, bow, and quiver after drinking the ceremonial quotient of pig's blood lit ablaze in liquor. The vindicating misanthropy that came from watching men break ceased the moment I entered the white sand. There, my cohorts were ferocious farm boys from the south, mountain children who'd buried their parents, Nilgord street types who'd killed long before military service. Trumpet the heavens! My nights were not only filled with grueling hours at the archery range, but my obsessed unfamiliarity with the lithe female body was quickly ripped from its veil. My brothers understood my animal plight. Most, fair-faced and well-versed in subsequent charm, escorted many a maiden into our bay to be ravaged by a pack of hungry, hooting hounds. Odd perhaps, perhaps not, but I'd felt an initial disappointment. The theater I'd longed for wasn't so merry. The following day my eagerness was restored, heightened in some ways as I felt I needed now desperately to attain some sense of satisfaction. Luckily, one generous wench had yet to shake off the night's drink and wobble home, allowing me a dozen more attempts from the confines of a latrine. Having temporarily gluttoned my thirst for women, war was the next siren's call. The White Sand would again occupy pale dunes, this time in the Far East. Trained to live in concealment, we heavily laden ghosts haunted the desert kingdom. What allowed me to remain an equal was not horse-like legs, nor a woodsman's shoulders. It wasn't innate leadership, and it damn sure wasn't my ability to enchant friends by the sheer veracity of my wit and charm. It was the irrefutable fact that every triumph, every brother I knocked out of the brawl pen back in the rear, every rock face I climbed with a combat load to find our enemy, every Azadi I shot to watch die, was another death blow to the miserable wretch I'd once been. Then, to my misfortune, the war had to end. The church well behind me, Adaline O'Varnia's art studio, graced the north block of Liralet. A boisterous rally point for many of the Pelliul's elite, by day the mirror black glass out front was an amusing opposite to where I'd been instructed to wait. At the studio's back entrance, I was staring at the bland chestnut door. I almost knocked a second time, but her habit of leaving me banging until sunrise if I violated our rules persuaded me otherwise. I was to knock but once. I settled for pulling out her note and reading it again. As always, my summons came not by call or by pigeon or by a courier whose face I might recognize. The note I'd found slipped under my door this morning was like all the rest, lustful caricatures of either the sun or the stars to indicate when, and a whiff of her perfume indicating why. For all I knew, she lived in a mansion and crawled up each night to her abode on the grinning moon. These 5 years that I'd worked for her, she'd maintained an unpierceable wall of mystery, revealing little more than her effortless ability to transform into the very traits of her tribe, majestic and cruel, every time I was summoned to where she'd have me. It was ironically appropriate, then, that the back of her studio was covered in generations of leaves of Luca. The crawling vines, if indelicately touched, would afflict their victim with a terrible itch. Awaiting the sounds of her descent, a casual observer might have watched me pace and jostle as if I'd wallowed in each and every one of them. High heels struck stairs beyond the chestnut. The rhythmic gait against the wood drummed visions of an executioner taunting their appointed victim while strutting to an axe. Or it would suggest my heart racing, as it now did, feeling for but an instant that it too stopped when the sound of her march ended at the other side of the door. Oh, those locks. 3, 5, maybe 20, I couldn't know. The moment I heard the first, it was as if I was being lifted onto a cloud. The last deadbolt slammed back. The door finally opened. Eyes were on me. Her courtly obligations were one reason our encounters were infrequent, making me howl in the lulls. However, her timing, as all else, was impeccable to the point you could easily believe she was able to read minds. Or at least mine. Though she was approaching the age when once reckless girls became grandmothers, I gazed upon her toned equestrian body. Other than heels, heavy and angular and black enough to win a bar fight. She wore nothing more than a quinarian ribbon pressing her breasts. I was not human. I was meat. I followed her up her stairway, positioned to watch the sway of her hips and everything between them. When she turned to delight at my ogling, her hair more than shimmered. The stairwell was adorned in an alternating cadence of lamplights, transforming the silk blackness which hung to her shoulders into their red and blues as we continued up. By the time we emerged into her loft, I'd already been instructed to lose the clothes. The same position was assumed always, her in her red oval chair, me on my knees, face between her legs. Then I waited. We stilled as candles burned, and my knees ached against the wood of the floor. She then bit her bottom lip and seized me. I swear to you, in all my experiences with women, nothing satisfied my appetite like attacking Adeline's own with the flicks of my tongue and the soft, rehearsed movements of my unworthy mouth. Not a row of wiggling bar whores could compare to such bliss, for surely I tried. She ruled me. I was slapped. I returned to my duty with renewed fervor, filling the loft with her echoes and howls. She pushed me on my back and slithered off her red oval chair. Once she'd grasped my throbbing member in her hand, she lurched forward, leered, and opened her mouth. This was a reoccurring game. Close as she would come to finally doing for me what normally I loved best. I was denied. Still I felt myself go stiff, then thrum, then shake, then explode. When I was finally able to control the shaking of my legs, I lifted my head to see that she still sat between them. They're sometimes purchased from strong cages in our markets, and Adeline's languid alertness was no different than one of them, the great hunting cats of Suella, and I had never hated or loved anything more.